In an ideal paradigm, the human psyche should function as a dynamic and elastic system. A psychologically flexible person would have the capacity to oscillate between different planetary energies depending on circumstances and astrological transits. This means they could manifest Saturnian qualities, structured, responsible, at one moment, and lunar qualities, sensitive, nurturing, at another, responding fluidly and adaptively to life's requirements. This state of constant oscillation would be the expression of psychic health in perfect dynamic balance. Fixation, the origin of polarity. However, the human psyche rarely operates according to this ideal model. In practice, it tends toward a process of fixation, where the identity clings to a single energetic pole and rejects its opposite. This is a maneuver of the developing ego seeking to build a stable and manageable identity, which inherently requires choosing one pole over another. For example, if a person's sun identity fixes on a Saturnian expression, I am hardworking, detached from affection, I care for others through responsibility, it automatically turns the opposite pole, the lunar, vulnerability, the need for care, into destiny. This fixation creates an artificial antagonism. That which moves us from our fixed and comfortable position is perceived as the enemy, an external force that opposes us, rather than being recognized as an integral part of our own psychic system. The basic imbalance of the personal mandala. Even before considering the complex transpersonal energies, we already start from a fundamental imbalance. The structure of the personal planets, which make up our psychological mandala, does not develop harmoniously. By nature, we tend not to integrate the following energetic pairs: Mercury, reason, communication, with Jupiter, trust, synthesis; Saturn, structure, limit, with the moon, sensitivity, need; Mars, action, desire, with Venus, receptivity, valuation. This first level of imbalance constitutes the ground upon which even more potent and destabilizing forces will act. This inherent imbalance in our personal psychological structure is the backdrop against which a force of even greater complexity erupts. The energies of the transpersonal planets. The eruption of transpersonal energies. A new dimension of imbalance. The presence of the transpersonal planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, introduces an additional layer of complexity that accentuates existing fixation and imbalance. Unlike the personal planets, which operate in a more direct and linear dynamic of opposition, the transpersonals play a different game, meaning they do not operate on a simple axis of opposites, but rather introduce an archetypal force that completely overwhelms the system. Their eruption into the childhood psychic system introduces an intensity that the forming structure of the self, the yo, is not prepared to assimilate. The crucial difference: personal versus transpersonal planets. To understand their impact, it is essential to distinguish the nature of both groups. Personal planets, associated with internal psychological functions and the structure of the self, correlate with concrete people in the environment, father, mother, sibling, allowing for psychic identification, form the structure through which a child builds their identity and relates to their immediate world. Transpersonal planets represent archetypal and collective forces that exceed the individual psyche, invade the personal structure from a dimension that cannot be personified or identified directly. They do not represent a concrete person. One will never meet Pluto on the street, but at most will meet someone with a lot of Pluto. This purely archetypal nature is precisely why the infant psyche, in its formative stage, cannot directly assimilate these energies. The impossibility of direct absorption. The central problem for childhood psychological development is that a child cannot organize their self from a purely Uranian, the eccentric, the unpredictable, Neptunian, the dissolving, the chaotic, or Plutonian, the destructive, the intense matrix. The intensity of these energies is so overwhelming that attempting to build an identity upon them would be the equivalent of trying to build a house in the middle of a typhoon, an erupting volcano, or a tsunami, the creation of a tolerable structure. Faced with this impossibility, the infant psyche resorts to an ingenious defense mechanism. To tolerate the immense volume of transpersonal energy, it is forced to unbalance and rearrange the structure of the personal planets. This process creates a psychic structure that, while distorted, is capable of withstanding the intensity. The way the psyche tends to organize itself is by unbalancing the structure of the personal planets in a very peculiar way to tolerate that transpersonal intensity. What is imbalance? In this context, the term distortion or imbalance should not be understood as a negative judgment or a pathology. It is, instead, the description of a necessary accommodation the psyche makes to give a tolerable form to an energy that, in its pure state, has none. The underlying reason for this mechanism is that the emotional containment we receive in childhood is often insufficient. As the text points out, the love with which we are raised is so poor that it does not provide us with a psychic structure elastic enough to open up to these vibrations without feeling that we will be destroyed. Distortion is, therefore, the result of closing oneself off to these vibrations in a peculiar way. A survival mechanism forced by the lack of loving containment that would allow us to remain open without disintegrating. Practical examples of imbalance in action: the Uranian child and the environment's reaction. A child with a heavy Uranian load in their birth chart may manifest this energy purely and unconsciously, for example, by sticking their fingers in a socket to receive the electrical discharge their system craves. This action, incomprehensible to adults, triggers a polarized and repeated reaction from parental figures, the Moon and Saturn. Every time the child manifests their Uranian nature, the parents react, creating a dynamic that unbalances the child's personal planet structure. Thus, the archetypal energy of Uranus is translated and integrated in a distorted way through the polarization of authority and care figures. The Plutonian child in the fantasy of destruction. In the case of a child with intense Pluto energy, the distortion process may follow a sequence like this. Internal sensation. From a very young age, the child feels a potent and disturbing internal vibration, like a volcano or a destructive drive they cannot understand. External event. An event occurs in the environment that resonates with that energy, such as the death of a close relative, for example, a grandmother. Creation of fantasy. The child's psyche, unable to process the Plutonian energy and the external event separately, merges them. It creates an unconscious fantasy in which the child is linked to destruction or even possesses destructive power. I have something to do with this. Systematic distortion. This fantasy becomes a pillar of their psychic organization, systematically distorting their relationship with power, loss, and their own identity over time. Ultimately, this distortion should not be seen as a pathology, but as an ingenious and necessary survival mechanism of the self. It is the first step the psyche takes to organize itself, laying the foundation for the later conscious work of rebalancing that will be necessary to contain and eventually integrate these formidable archetypal energies.